There are moments in human history when a voice pierces the veil of the known and brings to the surface truths that shake the foundations of everything we thought we understood. Between the 1960s and 1980s, in a modest home in Elmira, New York, one such voice emerged through Jane Roberts, a poet and writer who would become the channel for teachings that would profoundly challenge Western conceptions of God, reality, and the fundamental nature of existence. The name of this presence was Seth, an entity who described himself as a personality essence devoid of physical form, communicating through Jane in altered states of consciousness that produced thousands of pages of philosophical and spiritual material of extraordinary depth. The journey began unexpectedly, as so many profound transformations often do. Jane Roberts was not actively seeking mystical experiences or channelings when, in September 1963, during an ordinary evening while working on a poetry project, she experienced a sudden expansion of consciousness that flooded her with knowledge about the interconnected nature of all existence. This initial experience, unsettling in its intensity and clarity, opened perceptive doors that would never completely close. Months later, while experimenting with Ouija boards alongside her husband Robert Butts, messages began to flow with increasing coherence, until Jane herself started speaking directly as Seth, her voice transforming, her posture altering, while her husband meticulously transcribed every word uttered in those sessions that would span 21 years. What made Seth profoundly distinct from other channeled sources was not only the philosophical sophistication of his teachings, but the way he directly challenged the traditional religious structures that had shaped Western thought for millennia. Seth did not come to offer yet another variation of the same theological themes humanity had been repeating for centuries. He brought no promises of external salvation, demanded no worship, established no spiritual hierarchies based on merit or punishment. On the contrary, his words systematically dissolved the foundations upon which conventional religious thought had built cathedrals of dogma, revealing that the very search for an external, separate, judgmental God was fundamentally misguided from the outset. When Seth began to articulate his cosmology, it immediately became clear that he was presenting not a reform of traditional religious thought, but a complete revolution in the understanding of the relationship between consciousness, creation, and divinity. God, Seth asserted with a quiet certainty that permeated every session, was not a separate entity observing creation from a safe distance, was not a celestial king dispensing judgments and blessings according to divine whims, was not the severe or loving paternal figure that Abrahamic religions had constructed over the centuries. This anthropomorphic imagery, Seth argued, represented desperate human projections to comprehend something that fundamentally transcended the categories of ordinary human thought. The true nature of what we call God was simultaneously closer and vaster than any traditional theology had dared to imagine. All that is, the expression Seth preferred to use instead of the loaded word God, was described as a gestalt consciousness of infinite creativity, an inexhaustible source of creative energy that did not exist outside or above creation, but within every particle, every thought, every moment of existence. There was no separation between creator and created, between divinity and manifest reality, because the distinction itself was artificial, an artifact of human perceptive limitations that artificially divided what was fundamentally one. Every individual consciousness, every human being, every animal, every known and unknown life form, was literally a portion of all that is, experiencing itself through countless perspectives simultaneously, in a cosmic dance of self-knowledge that had no definable beginning or conceivable end. This revelation was not merely philosophical or theoretical. Seth insisted that understanding the true nature of God completely transformed the meaning of human existence and the responsibility each person carried for their experience of reality. If you were literally an extension of all that is, then there was no cosmic victim, no accident, no separation between you and the fundamental creative source of the universe. Every thought you entertained, every emotion you allowed to flow through you, every belief you held about yourself and reality, were acts of creation that directly shaped the physical experience you manifested moment by moment. Reality was not something that happened to you, but through you, and this subtle distinction carried revolutionary implications. Robert Butts, Jane's husband, who meticulously documented every session with Seth, often expressed his astonishment at the philosophical complexity and internal consistency of the teachings that emerged through his wife. Jane, in a normal state of consciousness, showed no particular interest in esoteric philosophy before the Seth sessions began. Her formal education was limited. Her prior reading did not include the mystical or philosophical texts with which Seth's teachings often dialogued in sophisticated ways. However, when Seth spoke through her, the language became eloquent, concepts flowed with crystal clarity, even when dealing with ideas of dizzying complexity, and there was a quiet authority that stemmed not from arrogance, but from a profound certainty about the nature of the reality being described. The books that emerged from these sessions, particularly Seth Speaks and The Nature of Personal Reality, presented a coherent metaphysics that integrated quantum physics, depth psychology, and mystical spirituality in ways that anticipated scientific and philosophical developments that would only become more widely discussed decades later. Seth spoke of parallel realities and multiple universes years before these concepts became common in theoretical physics. He discussed the constructed nature of time and the simultaneity of all temporal experiences in ways that echoed intuitions from relativity and quantum mechanics. He described consciousness as fundamental and matter as derivative, a position that contemporary philosophers of mind would intensely explore decades later under the titles of analytical idealism and panpsychism. What Seth offered was not blind faith in revealed dogmas, but an invitation to direct experimentation with the nature of consciousness and creation. Repeatedly, Seth encouraged readers to test the teachings in their own lives, to carefully observe the relationship between their habitual thoughts and the circumstances they manifested, to explore altered states of consciousness through dreams and meditation, to question all limiting beliefs they had absorbed from external sources without critical examination. There was no requirement to accept anything based solely on Seth's authority. Validation would come from direct experience, careful observation, and conscious experimentation with the presented principles. The central revelation Seth brought about the nature of God cannot be separated from his radical understanding of the structure of reality and the role of consciousness in the creation of all experience. When Seth asserted that God was not a separate entity, but a gestalt consciousness permeating all existence, he was simultaneously declaring something even more unsettling for the conventional religious mindset. You were not merely created by God, but you were God experiencing himself through a unique and unrepeatable perspective. This was not a declaration of spiritual arrogance or egoic delusion, but a precise description of the fundamental architecture of consciousness as Seth understood it. Every point of consciousness, every sentient being, was a window through which all that is knew itself more deeply, explored more possibilities, and expanded in more directions of creativity. This understanding immediately dissolved the existential anxiety that had tormented humanity for millennia, the terrible sense of separation from a distant and inaccessible divine source. If you already were, always had been, and always would be an inseparable portion of all that is, then there was no chasm to be crossed, no original sin separating you from your divine nature, no need for saving intermediaries between you and the source of existence. The spiritual journey was not about returning to an external God after a mythological fall, but about awakening to the truth that always was. You never left home, were never cast out of paradise, were never separated from the divinity that constitutes the deepest core of your being. Seth was incredibly clear about the practical implications of this revelation. If you were literally an aspect of all that is, expressing itself through physical form, then you carried within you all the creative capacities of that infinite source, though focused through the prism of an individual personality with its freely chosen selections, preferences, and limitations. Your consciousness was not an accidental product of material processes, an epiphenomenon emerging from cerebral chemical reactions without deeper meaning. On the contrary, matter was a product of consciousness, not the inverse. Your physical body, the world around you, the circumstances you faced, all emerged from layers of consciousness operating simultaneously, many of them outside ordinary conscious perception, but all responding to the patterns of belief, expectation, and emotional focus you consistently maintained. When Seth spoke of reality creation, he was not suggesting a type of superficial magical thinking where positive visualizations instantly manifested new cars or perfect relationships. Reality creation, as Seth described it, was a process deeply rooted in the structure of consciousness, operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Your most fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality, about who you were, about what was possible, functioned as invisible organizing structures that shaped what sensory information you perceived, what opportunities you recognized, what actions you considered possible. These beliefs were not just mental ideas floating on the surface of the mind, but dynamic, energetic patterns that literally attracted corresponding experiences through mechanisms operating beyond ordinary conscious perception. The concept of evil occupied a particular place in Seth's cosmology, and his approach to this topic was simultaneously comforting and radically challenging. Seth stated categorically that evil did not exist as an independent force in the universe. There was no Satan, no demons, no malevolent entities working against the light or trying to corrupt human souls. These figures were massive psychic projections, collective hallucinations created by humanity through millennia of fear, ignorance, and misunderstanding about the nature of consciousness. When millions of people believed in the existence of the devil, they invested creative energy in that belief, and this collective energy created thought forms that could seem real and even exert influence over those who believed in them. But these forms had no independent existence or power of their own beyond what was granted to them through belief and fear. This revelation did not deny the existence of destructive actions, cruelty, or violence in the physical world. Seth was not naive about the suffering that existed in human experience. But he completely recontextualized the origin and meaning of this suffering. Acts we call evil emerged from consciousnesses operating under deep illusions of separation, existential fear, and fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of reality. When someone believed themselves to be fundamentally separate from all other existence, when they perceived the universe as hostile and scarce, when they had internalized beliefs about unworthiness or threat, these perceptive distortions could generate destructive behaviors. But these behaviors did not reflect an inherent evil nature or a cosmic force of evil operating through individuals, but rather consciousnesses temporarily lost in labyrinths of their own limiting beliefs. The nature of the soul received equal recontextualization in Seth's teachings. Traditional religious conceptions often described the soul as a static entity, created at a specific moment, undergoing an earthly life of testing, and then receiving eternal judgment based on performance during those brief physical years. Seth presented a radically different view. The soul was not a finished product, but a dynamic process of continuous expansion, a gestalt consciousness that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions and realities, exploring countless variations of experience, learning through each perspective, integrating each understanding into an ever-growing totality. You were one of many simultaneous expressions of this larger entity, connected yet distinct, maintaining individuality while participating in a vaster collective identity. This understanding of the soul as a continuous process dissolved the terror of death that haunted much of human experience. Death was not termination or judgment, but transition, a shift of focus from one dimension of experience to another. The consciousness you were could not be extinguished because consciousness was not a product of material processes, but the fundamental substance of all reality. When the physical body ceased to function, consciousness continued in other dimensions, exploring other modes of existence, eventually choosing new incarnations to explore more possibilities for experience and growth. There was no end, No eternal condemnation, no annihilation. There was only continuous movement through multiple dimensions of reality, each offering its own unique opportunities for learning and expansion. Seth also introduced the extraordinary concept of probable realities, an idea that dramatically expanded the understanding of what it meant to exist. Every choice you considered but did not follow, every possibility you contemplated but rejected, every path you saw but did not take, did not simply vanish into non-existence. These possibilities were actualized in parallel reality systems that were equally valid and real. There were versions of you exploring each significant variation of choice, each experiencing the full consequences of that alternative decision. If you had considered becoming a musician but chose law, a probable version of you was living the life of a musician in a parallel reality, while you explored the legal path in this one. Both versions were equally real. Both contributed to the broader understanding of the larger entity you were. Both enriched the totality of your soul through their unique experiences. This multiplicity of probable versions was not a cause for confusion or existential anxiety, but a dramatic expansion of what it meant to be conscious. You were far vaster, simultaneously exploring multiple timelines, multiple variations of identity, each contributing its unique perspective to a greater consciousness that encompassed all these versions. Occasionally, in dreams or altered states, you might catch glimpses of these other versions, feel the texture of their alternative lives, receive intuitions or information they had developed through their own unique paths. The depth of Seth's teachings on the nature of God and existence demanded a complete reconsideration of concepts humanity had taken for granted for millennia. Physical matter itself, that which seemed so solid and undeniable, was revealed as merely a narrow band of a much broader spectrum of reality. Seth explained that matter, as perceived by human senses, represented only a specific vibrational frequency within an infinite continuum of material forms operating at different rates of vibration. Other types of matter, other dimensions of physical reality, coexisted in the same apparent space but vibrated at frequencies that human senses were not designed to detect. Scientists studied atoms and molecules, but observed only those that existed within the limited perceptive range of instruments created based on presuppositions about what constitutes matter. This revelation was not a philosophical abstraction without practical consequences. If physical matter was just one manifestation among many possible, then reality was far more malleable, far more responsive to consciousness than scientific materialism allowed for. The apparent limits of the physical world were not absolute barriers, but temporary boundaries of perception that could be expanded through conscious development. Altered states of consciousness, dreams, mystical experiences were not deviations from a true physical reality, but windows into other equally valid dimensions of existence that operated under different principles than those governing ordinary physical reality. Each state of consciousness literally created its own world of experience, its own version of reality, with its own laws and possibilities. Time received particular attention in Seth's teachings, for few illusions were more deeply rooted in human perception than temporal linearity. Seth asserted that time was not an objective dimension in which events unfolded in irreversible sequence from the past through the present toward the future. Time was a psychic organizing structure, a way that physically focused consciousness used to sequence experiences that in reality existed simultaneously. Past, present, and future coexisted in an eternal now, accessible and influenceable in ways that ordinary consciousness rarely recognized. Memories were not static records of completed events, but dynamic constructions continuously updated based on present understanding and current emotional focus. This radical understanding of time had transformative implications. If the past was not fixed but fluid, then you could literally alter past events by changing how you related to them in the present. Not through physical time travel, but through emotional reconnection and psychic recontextualization. When you fundamentally changed your understanding of a past event, when you transformed the emotional meaning it carried, you were literally creating a different probable past. The version of the event you now remembered and felt became your lived reality, while the previous version continued to exist in a probable timeline you no longer inhabited. Every moment of profound understanding, every instance of genuine forgiveness, every transformation of interpretation not only changed your present, but retroactively recreated your past. Seth also explored the multiple levels of consciousness operating simultaneously during each moment of waking life. The ego's focal consciousness, the one you identify as you most of the time, was only a small portion of your total consciousness. Below and around this superficial consciousness, numerous other levels operated continuously, managing bodily processes, monitoring multidimensional environments, communicating with other consciousnesses on non-physical levels, accessing information from remote times and places. These levels normally did not intrude into waking consciousness because that would create paralyzing information overload. But through careful attention, deliberate practice, and openness to unusual experiences, you could begin to access more of these layers of consciousness, dramatically expanding what was available for conscious perception. Thoughts and images that seemed random, impulses that arose without apparent reason, dreams that defied conventional interpretation, all frequently represented communications from these deeper levels of consciousness, attempting to convey information, insight, or guidance. The ordinary conscious mind, trained to focus narrowly on consensual physical reality, usually dismissed these communications as unimportant mental noise. Seth encouraged the development of a different attitude, a gentle receptivity to unusual mental content, careful observation of patterns that could emerge from these seemingly random communications. Often, there was structure and meaning where superficially there seemed to be only chaos. But recognizing this structure required expanding beyond habitual modes of interpretation and analysis. The ego received significant recontextualization in Seth's teachings. Spiritual traditions often presented the ego as an enemy or obstacle that needed to be transcended or destroyed to achieve spiritual enlightenment. Seth completely rejected this perspective. The ego was a necessary and valuable tool for navigating physical reality, a focusing mechanism that allowed consciousness to concentrate effectively on one dimension of experience without being overwhelmed by stimuli from all other simultaneously accessible dimensions. The problem was not the ego's existence, but its rigidity. Its tendency to restrict perception to only a narrow band of possibilities out of habit and fear rather than real necessity. Seth used the metaphor of a flashlight to describe the ego's function. You carried a flashlight that illuminated only a small area of a vast territory of consciousness. Out of conditioned habit and learned limitations, you always pointed this flashlight in the same direction, repeatedly illuminating the same familiar territory, assuming that this small illuminated area was the totality of what existed. But the territory was infinitely vaster than that small island of light. You could, at any moment, choose to turn the flashlight, point it in new directions, illuminate territories of consciousness that had always existed around you but remained invisible because your focused attention had never illuminated them. Spiritual expansion did not mean destroying the flashlight, but learning to move it deliberately, explore more territory. Recognize that the familiar was not the totality of the real. The implications of this expanded understanding of consciousness were profoundly empowering. You were not a victim of external forces beyond your control, were not at the mercy of an indifferent or hostile universe, did not depend on external saviors or divine intermediaries to access your own creative power. Everything you needed already existed within you because you were literally a portion of all that is. The limitations you experienced were not impositions of objective reality, but reflections of limiting beliefs you had absorbed from culture, family, misinterpreted experiences. These beliefs could be identified, questioned, and transformed through conscious and persistent work. Seth offered practical guidance for this work of belief transformation. The first step was to develop radical honesty about what you truly thought and felt, not what you presumed you should think and feel. Not what you had been taught was appropriate or spiritual, but the actual content of your consciousness moment by moment. Many people lived dissociated from their own genuine thoughts and emotions, operating based on layers of shoulds and supposed tos that had never been consciously examined. Bringing these patterns into clear consciousness without judgment or censure was an essential prerequisite for any real change. The second step was to carefully observe the connections between habitual thought patterns and recurring life circumstances. If you consistently experienced certain types of problems or limitations, there were invariably underlying beliefs creating these experiences. These beliefs often operated outside focal consciousness, but their consequences were visible in life patterns. Working backward from these external patterns to the internal beliefs that created them was like psychic archaeology. Excavating through layers of conditioning to reach fundamental structures that organized experience. Once clearly identified, these beliefs lost much of their automatic power. You could then begin to deliberately replace them with more expansive beliefs, more aligned with your authentic nature as a portion of all that is. The true revolution in Seth's teachings did not lie merely in his abstract philosophical ideas about the nature of God and existence, but in how these principles could be directly applied to transform everyday human experience. Seth never presented his revelations as distant theory for intellectual contemplation, but as practical maps for conscious navigation of the reality each person was creating moment by moment through their thoughts, emotions, and beliefs. The crucial question was not whether these teachings were philosophically elegant or spiritually inspiring, but whether they worked when applied with sincerity and persistence in the confusing complexity of real life with all its challenges, difficult relationships, financial limitations, physical illnesses, and emotional crises. When Seth asserted that consciousness creates reality, he was making a verifiable statement through direct personal experimentation. You could begin by carefully observing your habitual thought patterns regarding any problematic area of your life. If relationships were consistently difficult, what were the internal narratives you held about relationships? If money was always scarce, what were the deep beliefs you carried about abundance, deservingness, or the nature of financial security? If physical illnesses were recurrent, what emotions did you chronically suppress? What tensions did you maintain as habitual bodily patterns? These questions were not exercises in self-blame, but invitations to recognize connections that normally remained invisible between internal and external worlds. The key lay in developing the capacity for non-judgmental observation of your own mental content. Many people, when they began to pay genuine attention to their habitual thoughts, were shocked by the negativity, fear, and fierce criticism that operated as a constant background narrative. Decades of cultural conditioning, unprocessed traumas, messages absorbed from authority figures during vulnerable childhood, all created layers of toxic internal dialogue that functioned as automatic programming, generating corresponding experiences without the person having clear awareness of the causal connection. Seth insisted that bringing these patterns into the light of consciousness was an act of courage and self-compassion, not destructive self-criticism. A woman who participated in Seth's sessions shared during a class that she spent weeks documenting every thought she had about money. She discovered that she rarely allowed herself to think of financial abundance without immediately following with disqualifying thoughts. It would be nice to have more money, but people like me never achieve wealth. Or, if I had more, someone would probably take it from me. Or, money corrupts, so perhaps it's better to stay where I am. This discovery was initially devastating, as she recognized that she was actively sabotaging any possibility of financial improvement through this constant internal dialogue. But the discovery was also liberating, because now she could see the precise mechanisms through which she created limitation, and therefore could deliberately begin to replace them with more expansive beliefs. The process of changing beliefs was not instantaneous or magical, as Seth repeatedly clarified. Deeply rooted beliefs had been reinforced through years or decades of repetition, intense emotion, and apparent confirmation through experiences they themselves had created. Replacing these structures required patience, persistence, and repeated conscious practice. You could not simply declare a new belief once and expect instant transformation. You needed to work consistently to challenge old thoughts when they arose, consciously choose different perspectives, emotionally reinforce the new beliefs through visualization and feeling until they began to acquire the psychic weight necessary to manifest corresponding experiences. Seth also emphasized the crucial importance of emotions in this reality creation process. Thoughts alone, disconnected from genuine emotional investment, had limited creative power. It was the combination of clear thought and intense emotion that functioned as fuel for physical manifestation. This understanding explained why positive affirmations often failed to produce desired changes. People mechanically repeated phrases about abundance or health, while emotionally remaining anchored in fear, despair, or disbelief. Authentic emotion, not the superficial phrase, was what signaled to the deeper consciousness what experiences you genuinely expected and were prepared to receive. Relationships offered particularly fertile ground for applying Seth's principles of reality creation. Every person in your life, Seth explained, was responding not only to your superficial behavior, but to your deep expectations and beliefs about relationships. If you carried an unconscious belief that you would always be betrayed, you subconsciously selected partners with a propensity for betrayal, or, through subtle patterns of behavior guided by unconscious expectations, created dynamics that led to betrayal, even with partners who would not normally act that way. It was not that you consciously desired betrayal, but that the strong belief acted as a magnet, attracting corresponding experience to validate the existing belief. This revelation could initially seem unsettling, as if you were to blame for everything difficult you experienced. But Seth insisted that understanding was not about blame, but about power. If you had unconsciously created limiting or painful experiences through misguided beliefs, then you equally had the power to create expansive and joyful experiences through transformed beliefs. No one else had control over your inner reality. External circumstances could present challenges, but your response, interpretation, and the meaning you attributed to those circumstances remained absolutely under your domain. This was a territory of inviolable freedom that no external force could invade without your conscious or unconscious permission. The question of collective suffering, wars, natural disasters, epidemics, was frequently raised by students of Seth's teachings. If each person created their reality, how to explain large-scale events that affected millions? Seth responded that collective events emerged from collective beliefs, from massive psychic consensuses about the nature of reality that millions held simultaneously. Entire cultures could share beliefs about scarcity, external threat, the need for violence for security, and these collective beliefs manifested corresponding circumstances that then affected all participants in that cultural matrix. But even within collective events, each individual experienced that event through the filter of their own particular beliefs, drawing unique lessons and meanings. More crucially, you participated in collective events only to the extent that they aligned with your own paths of development and exploration. The idea of innocent victims randomly caught by events over which they had no control was incompatible with Seth's understanding of reality creation. Each participating consciousness had, at some level, often beyond ordinary conscious perception, chosen to participate in that specific event for reasons related to its own growth and exploration. This was not a justification of violence or indifference to suffering, but a recognition that consciousness was never a passive victim, even when the limitations of focal perception made it seem so. The practical implications also extended to physical health. Seth presented the body not as a biological machine operating independently of consciousness, but as a direct physical expression of emotional states and belief patterns. Illnesses were not random accidents or invasions by external pathogens operating independently of psychological context, but communications from the deeper self signaling imbalances, suppressed emotions, or beliefs that were impeding the natural flow of vitality. Fever could represent the body's attempt to burn off toxic emotional patterns. Joint pains could reflect psychological rigidity or resistance to change. Digestive problems often correlated with difficulty in assimilating experiences or emotions. This understanding did not mean rejecting conventional medicine or blaming sick people. Seth encouraged the pragmatic use of any healing modality in which the person genuinely trusted, whether it was allopathic medicine, alternative treatments, or purely psychological work. The crucial factor was authentic belief in the efficacy of the chosen modality, because that belief activated the body's natural self-healing capacities. Simultaneously, working with the emotional and belief dimensions that contributed to the manifestation of the illness accelerated healing and prevented recurrence. Genuine health was not merely the absence of symptoms, but vitality flowing from alignment between conscious beliefs, emotional patterns, and the authentic impulses of the deeper self. The legacy of Seth's teachings through Jane Roberts remains one of the most transformative bodies of spiritual wisdom to emerge in the 20th century. Not because it offered easy solace or promises of external salvation, but because it returned to humanity something that had been systematically stripped away through millennia of religious and cultural conditioning: total creative responsibility for the experience of reality and recognition of the inherent divinity in every consciousness. This dual revelation that you were simultaneously the creator of your experience and an inseparable portion of all that is, dissolved the foundations upon which existential anxiety, learned helplessness, and the desperate search for external saviors had been built. This dual revelation that you were simultaneously the creator of your experience and an inseparable portion of all that is, dissolved the foundations upon which existential anxiety, learned helplessness, and the desperate search for external saviors had been built. What emerged in place of these limiting structures was something simultaneously more challenging and infinitely more liberating: an invitation to assume conscious authorship of one's own existence. When Seth asserted that God was not a separate entity observing from a safe distance, but a gestalt consciousness permeating all creation, he was effectively demolishing spiritual hierarchies that had kept humanity in a subordinate position for so long. There were no necessary intermediaries between you and the creative source of the universe, because you were a direct expression of that source. There were no specific rituals or particular creeds required to access divine power, because that power constituted the essential core of your own being. There were no specific rituals or particular creeds required to access divine power, because that power constituted the essential core of your own being. There was no final judgment awaiting after physical death, because the universe did not operate based on systems of punishment and reward, but on infinite exploration of possibilities through countless perspectives of consciousness. This revelation did not render physical life purposeless or meaningless. On the contrary, it imbued every moment of earthly experience with profound importance. You had chosen this specific life, this particular body, these unique circumstances, not as punishment for past transgressions or a test of spiritual merit, but as a rich opportunity for the exploration of specific aspects of consciousness that could only be investigated through this particular combination of factors. Every challenge you faced, every relationship you navigated, every emotion you processed, contributed to the expansion not only of your individual consciousness, but of the greater cosmic consciousness of which you were an inseparable part. Nothing was wasted, nothing was without purpose, even when purpose was not immediately apparent to the limited perception of the focal ego. The 3 decades since Jane Roberts' death in 1984 have seen an explosion of interest in consciousness, quantum physics, and the relationship between observer and observed reality, areas that validate many central principles Seth had articulated decades earlier. Quantum physicists seriously discuss the role of consciousness in the collapse of wave functions. Philosophers of mind explore panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is fundamental rather than derived from material processes. Neuroscientists discover brain plasticity that demonstrates how thoughts and mental practices literally reshape the physical structure of the brain.
Each of these developments echoes principles that Seth had presented when they were even more radical and less culturally acceptable. But scientific validation, while interesting, was never a central point of Seth's teachings. Seth was not trying to convince skeptics through arguments or external evidence. He was inviting each person to direct experimentation with the nature of consciousness and reality creation.
The proof would not come from laboratories or philosophical arguments, but from persistent application of the principles in one's own life. When you consciously began to observe the connection between your habitual thoughts and recurring circumstances, when you deliberately experimented with changing beliefs and observed corresponding changes in external experience, when you practiced accessing deeper levels of consciousness through dreams and meditation, you acquired validation that no external authority could provide or remove. This emphasis on direct experience and personal verification was radically democratic and profoundly empowering. You did not need permission from priests, approval from gurus, or initiation into esoteric traditions to explore the nature of your own consciousness and experiment with reality creation. The tools were your own natural capacities for thought, emotion, imagination, and attentional focus. The territory was your own mental space and life experience.
The laboratory was every moment of waking existence. No one could do this work for you, but also no one could prevent you from doing it if you sincerely chose to invest the necessary effort. The practical challenges of living according to these principles should not be minimized. Lifelong conditioning, constant social pressures, continuous validation of scientific materialism through every interaction with modern culture, all conspired to pull attention back to old ways of thinking and perceiving. Moments of doubt were inevitable. Periods where principles seemed not to work, where external reality remained stubbornly resistant to transformation efforts, tested commitment and perseverance. Seth never promised an easy path, never suggested that intellectual knowledge of these principles would automatically transform experience. Real transformation required sustained work, relentless honesty, and a willingness to confront and dissolve layers of limiting belief that had been built through years of conditioning. But for those who persisted, who applied the principles with sincerity through months and years rather than days and weeks, changes began to manifest in ways impossible to deny. Relationships transformed as old expectations were replaced by genuine openness. Opportunities arose when beliefs about limitation were consistently challenged. Health improved when suppressed emotions were processed, and belief patterns about physical vulnerability were revised. Synchronicities increased as consciousness expanded beyond the narrow focus of the habitual ego. None of these changes came through magic or violation of natural laws, but through increasing alignment between conscious beliefs, emotional expectations, and the authentic impulses of the deeper self. Preserve the original language that allowed for the manifestation of potentialities that had always existed but remained inaccessible as internal conflicts blocked their emergence. Seth's teaching on the nature of God and existence does not offer final answers that close off investigation, but invitations to exploration that never ends. Every understanding achieved reveals deeper layers of mystery. Every expansion of consciousness makes visible vast territories yet unexplored. This is the nature of existence as Seth describes it: perpetual movement of discovery, infinite creativity expressing itself through countless forms and perspectives. Consciousness knowing itself more completely through each unique experience that each individual entity contributes to the ever-growing totality. You are not traveling toward a fixed destination, but participating in an endless journey of exploration and expansion.
All the richer because each individual perspective offers something absolutely unique that no other consciousness can contribute in precisely the same way. Jane Roberts, that woman who never sought spiritual fame or a position as a religious leader, became a conduit for teachings that continue to reverberate through decades because they touch something profoundly true about the nature of consciousness and the structure of reality. Her courage in sharing experiences that could easily have subjected her to ridicule, her integrity in meticulously documenting sessions even when the content challenged her own presuppositions,
her balance in maintaining a normal life while serving as a channel for extraordinary wisdom, all created a legacy that transcended her physical life. The books remain, the transcribed sessions remain, and more importantly, the principles remain available for experimentation and validation by anyone willing to invest the necessary effort. The final message that resonates through all of Seth's teachings is simultaneously simple and profound. You are far more than you imagine, far more powerful than you have been taught to believe, far more connected to the creative source of the universe than religious traditions have allowed for. Your life is not a cosmic accident or a test of spiritual merit, but a sacred exploration of unique possibilities that only you can investigate through this particular perspective. Every moment offers an opportunity for conscious creation instead of unconscious reaction. Every thought you choose to entertain, every emotion you allow to flow, every belief you decide to hold or release directly shapes the reality you experience. This is not a burden, but a gift, not a prison, but freedom, not a cause for anxiety, but a source of profound empowerment. Now, having explored these teachings that challenge the foundations of conventional thought about God and existence, the invitation extends to you. Not to accept blindly based on the authority of Seth or Jane Roberts, but to experiment directly with the principles in your own life. Observe your habitual thoughts without judgment. Identify limiting beliefs that operate beneath the surface of ordinary consciousness. Consciously experiment with changing perspectives and observe what happens in external experience. Explore altered states through dreams, meditation, or simply careful attention to more subtle levels of consciousness constantly operating. Allow yourself to discover through direct practice that you are truly the creator of your reality, an inseparable portion of all that is, divine consciousness exploring itself through your absolutely unique perspective. If these teachings resonated with something deep within you, share this journey with others who may be seeking a more expansive understanding of their own nature. Subscribe to continue exploring these transformative ideas, and, more importantly, share your own experiences and discoveries in the comments. How do these principles appear when you apply them in your life? What resistances do you encounter? What openings emerge? Your unique journey contributes to collective understanding, and your voice adds a perspective that no one else can offer in precisely the same way. The conversation continues, the exploration never ends, and each participating consciousness enriches the totality through its unique contribution.